Well, hello everyone. My name is Adrien Zakar, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto.
Welcome, everyone. So my name is Madiha Tahir. I'm a Mellon postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at ASU. Adrien and I are moderators for today's event hosted by Columbia University, where both of us received our PhDs. The event is part of a seminar series, Technologies of Power, where we host 3 speakers every other Friday throughout the fall.
Today's event considers warscapes together with techniques and technologies of placemaking and empire. We have 3 wonderful speakers who each consider the question of geospatialities and temporalities that extend the parameters of imperial power in both colonial and settler colonial contexts. And while they examine different sites and spaces, all 3 presentations push us towards some shared questions. One of them is how does the construction of spatial and temporal divisions help constitute the global North and global South as ideas and material spaces? Another one is how can we use these different sites and spaces to refine our theoretical lens on imperial formation? And yet another one is how do ideas, frameworks, and theories do or do not transit from one place to another?
So you can find the full biographies of our speakers. They will be posted in the chat, but I will introduce them very briefly. Our first speaker today is Kate Chandler. Catherine Chandler's research examines the intersection of technology, media, and politics through a range of scales and forms. Her first monograph, Unmanning: How Humans, Machines, and Media Perform Drone Warfare, studies unmanned aircraft from 1936 to 1992. Our second speaker today, who will be joining us shortly, is Eli Nelson. He is an assistant professor of American Studies at Williams College and the director of fellowships at the Center for Black, Brown, and Queer Studies. Dr. Nelson's current book manuscript is Sovereign Knowledge: The History of Native Science in the United States Empire, and it traces the history of indigenous scientific knowledge production under colonial settler rule. Our final speaker today is Britney Mache. She is an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersection of environmental studies, security studies, African diaspora studies, and science and technology studies. She is also an assistant professor of environmental studies at Williams College. Thank you for joining us.
Let me explain how we're going to run today's event. Each of the speakers have pre-recorded brief presentations, and after each presentation, we'll open the floor for 10 to 15 minutes questions from the audience. We encourage the audience to post their questions in the chat. We also encourage the panelists to engage each other's presentations. After the last presentation, we'll open the floor for further questions to all 3 speakers.
Hi, my name is Kate Chandler. My talk today is entitled Apartheid Drone: Infrastructures of Militarism and Hidden Genealogies of the South African Seeker. I would like to thank the organizers for their work producing Technologies of Power, Tracing Empire at Home and Abroad, as well as my fellow panelists in the session devoted to Warscapes, Geographies of Violence, and the funding provided by the Dean of the Humanities War and Peace Initiative Grant at Columbia University. Today, I will share with you research from an article in progress on the South African Seeker drone, a surveillance platform and weapon developed under apartheid with support from Israel in the late 1970s and early 1980s. As Sasha Polakowsaransky explains, during the period, Israel profited handsomely from arms exports, and South Africa gained access to cutting-edge weaponry at a time when the rest of the world was turning against the apartheid state. The Seeker was used in Operation Protea in present-day Angola in 1981, a year before the deployment of the Scout aircraft in Bekaa Valley in 1982, typically cited as the inaugural use of modern drone technologies. The U.S. military drone program also draws from these technologies, purchasing the Pioneer from Israel in 1985. To be clear, the weapons that I am referring to were armed with cameras in the 1980s and differ from current technologies used by the United States and Israel that integrate a missile with the unmanned platform. Unmanned aircraft in the 1980s relied on radio rather than satellite link and could be only flown for relatively short distances, up to 50 miles, from the control station. This meant that the aircraft were particularly suitable for border conflicts like the Lebanon War in the 1980s or the South African border wars, and were primarily used for surveillance and to attract anti-aircraft fire. At the same time, all three countries carried out experiments with these aircraft that would turn them into attack platforms. During Truth and Reconciliation, the South African Air Force was accused of using the Seeker armed with chemical weapons in Mozambique, although a UN investigation into the matter was inconclusive. I bring forward this shared genealogy to work through how aerial optics of the drone, the racial privileges advanced by apartheid, and the ideology of technological advance are interconnected within the Seeker, and how these associations traffic between neocolonial wars in the 1980s and the US-led war on terror beginning in 2001. I also want to take stock of how South Africa's role as a leader in the development of the drone aircraft has largely been erased and replaced with a narrative from the global north, exemplified by a 2017 headline in the New York Times, "High above, drones keep watchful eyes on Africa," that deploys drone aircraft in Africa writ large to protect endangered species. The intervention of this work is to complement the theories of feminist and post-colonial scholars who study targeting and its normalization in everyday life. Karen Kaplan observes how GPS during the first Gulf War served as an advertisement for now ubiquitous mapping technologies. Ray Chow underlines how the Age of the World target led to the creation of area studies in the United States during the Cold War, which serve as the organizing logic for many university programs, including the School of Foreign Service, where I teach. While Samuel Weber notes that both diversity hires and the capture of Saddam Hussein are described as targets of opportunity. Targeting, as Sheila Mbembe observes in Necropolitics, divides the world into above and below, while ideas of progress, advance, and development attempt to undo and naturalize the violence of this hierarchy. In the case of the South African Seeker, however, I attend not only to how the enemy is framed by the platform, succinctly described by Derek Gregory as a view to a kill, but the counterpart of this view. The drone also establishes a field of protection and privilege for a particular subset of people, a version of the normalization of war that Foucault describes in Society Must Be Defended. In the case of apartheid South Africa, unmanned aircraft are aligned with white supremacy, while the logic of technological advance normalizes a racialized divide that separates above from below. The drone figures as a society under attack that must be defended, even though the drone is an unmanned decoy, a surveillance camera, and secret weapon. In online forums devoted to the South African Air Force during apartheid, commentators often emphasize the invisible superiority proposed by unmanning and the humor that their technology is perceived to be man. A commentator writes, "It was amusing to read that when one drone was shot down, the enemy spent 3 days looking for the pilot. It is also amazing how far ahead in technology we were in those days." Another recalls, in 1983, an unmanned aerial vehicle was lost over Mozambique after it was shot down by a Soviet SA-3 missile, after quite a few Soviet SA-3 missiles had been fired at it. Well, it was busy doing post-strike damage assessment on a raid by an Impala leg strike aircraft as a reprisal for the Church Street bombing in Pretoria. A corollary to this invisible sphere of protection can be found in accounts of US soldiers who describe drone aircraft as guardian angels, or the recent deployment of United States drones to watch Black Lives Matter protests in Minneapolis, or the policing of migration along the border of Mexico, which aligned the aircraft with an invisible white population that must be protected. The overlay of wartime protection, border controls, and policing is also apparent in the uses that are proposed for the seeker following the end of apartheid. For a brief period, in the 1990s, the state-controlled Armaments Corporation, which secretly acquired the drone from Israel in the previous decade, aimed to rebrand the drone as a tool for democratic protections. The company reveals the secret existence of the drone in 1995. A company report explains the seeker remotely piloted aircraft developed some years ago was successfully deployed during the 1994 elections to monitor unrest areas. The South African Army is also using the system to monitor attempts to cross the national borders illegally. Here, the divisions between above and below are replaced by national policing and border protection, even as it is clear these new uses build on the privileges of a particular protected population. By the 2000s, however, South Africa's unmanned aircraft had become a footnote in the emerging use of drone aircraft for targeted killing by Israel and the United States beginning in 2000. For nearly a decade, these strikes are not explicitly acknowledged by the United States government and instead are a, quote, secret weapon. Yet if one looks closely, one can still find traces of the South African seeker, notably in a 2003 article in the Wall Street Journal, Drones Outfitted for Combat Are the Next on Defense Firms' Radar, which describes the South African seeker as having already transitioned to non-military purposes, noting among its uses, locating poachers in game reserves. By the mid-2010s, the global north will return to the idea of drone aircraft for wildlife conservation, now as an ostensibly good use of the technology that was developed for the war on terror. Their history as an apartheid weapon is largely erased. The wartime uses of the seeker against African revolutionary forces in multiple countries becomes a benevolent protection for endangered species. Notably, these uses for drone aircraft have substantial limitations and questions remain about their effectiveness for anti-poaching, especially given that they do not address the root causes, which include demand for a rhinoceros horn in Asia and social, political, and economic inequities in Southern Africa. At the present moment, drone aircraft are widely imagined as a tool for militaries and police, as well as for commercial delivery, humanitarian aid, wildlife management, and journalism. In reckoning with these new uses, it is important to dissect how logics of technological advance and democratic protections are entangled with racial hierarchies and military divisions. Drone aircraft will continue to reproduce the divides of targeting and protection unless these patterns are explicitly refashioned through attention to the unequal relationships made by the drone. This work calls for careful attention to the populations that drone target, found, for example, in the scholarship of Madiha Tahir and Ivan Char Lopez, as well as making visible how secrecy, nation, and environment are used to normalize hierarchies that the drone instantiates both in wartime violence and increasingly in daily life.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that wonderful presentation. Just have her come on. Your talk really follows on from the seminar, our initial conversation, our opening conversation for this series, which was with Karen Kaplan, who actually talked about the war's racialized and gendered entanglements with everyday life. And I hear an echo of that in your kind of presentation about the environmental quote unquote good uses of the drone, of the seeker drone, and the erasure of its militarist history. So I wanted to start out by asking you a little bit and draw out this link that you make between racialization, apartheid, and the ideology of technical advance. And maybe a way to do that is to ask you to sort of elaborate a little bit on the political conditions under which the seeker drone was developed. You mentioned that this was obviously happening. Israel was trading with the apartheid South African regime. The broader context for this is obviously the Cold War. And I imagine South Africa's desire to contain decolonization and movements and ideas of decolonization. So can you elaborate a little bit on the historical conditions that engender in which the seeker drone is being developed and deployed?
Yes, I'd love to. So if one of the hosts could turn on my video, I am not able to do so myself. I would love to be able to see. But in the meantime, I will get started answering the question to sort of think about some of the historical conditions. There's a lot of different politics that are happening during the Cold War. And so one of the themes of this is to sort of think about relationships between the global North and the global South, and also problematize the sort of simplicity of that kind of logic, and think about the ways in which these sort of binary bifurcations in themselves are deeply problematic, and the sort of messy histories that we can think about here. And part of what I'm trying to do in this talk is really disrupt, first of all, this clear association between the drone and the war on terror, right? There's a much longer story that can be told about drone aircraft. And in my first book, I do this from the story of the US, right? And so I talk about the US as having worked on these weapon systems since the 1930s, and I elaborate how US exchanges with Israel enable the sort of and result in the development of today's Predator platform. And when I was doing this research, I realized that there was another story here that I didn't see other people talking about, which is that before the Israel collaborated with the US, they had sold this weapon to South Africa. And this was significant to me for a number of reasons, because right, the sale of weapons during the early 1980s was illegal. There was a UN arms embargo, and so no weapons were supposed to be sold to South Africa. And it's widely known that Israel violated this arms embargo, but it's less widely known that it violated this arms embargo to sell the drone. And so what is interesting to me here is, again, this is very hard history to find. So I only have traces, and some of the traces that I'm working with are people reflecting on this historical moment. So the quotes that I read in my presentation are reflections of operators looking back at that time period. I was not given access by either the Israeli archives or the South African archives to look at any of these materials, but there are traces of documents that have been released to other journalists. I'm not a journalist, but to journalists who shared these documents with me, and you can begin to piece together a sort of story here. And one of the things that's important is the role of the US. On the one hand, as ostensibly supporting the embargo and working against the apartheid state, even as during the Ronald Reagan era, the US it's widely known that the US is providing secret support to South African forces in their fight against communist neighbors, basically. So there's wars going on here with Angola, with Mozambique, and these are the sort of context that is happening here. And we can think about this as parallel to secret missions that are happening in Latin America, secret missions that are happening in Afghanistan, Pakistan, right? So I want to sort of bring out how these histories of sort of secret CIA-funded military operations are not just from the time of drone warfare, but rather have this Cold War genealogy as well. And that is sort of the story that I'm working with here.
Thank you so much, Kate. We actually have an audience question here, and I'm going to roll that into a question that I have as well, which is, how do you sort of respond to those who say that the drone is just a tool, that it can be used for good or bad? And as you know, I'm asking this question because there is sort of an assumption, a kind of philosophy of technology that underlies these kinds of statements. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about technology and its relationship to the world. And the audience question here is, that the use of modern technologies for military and police targets can cause a lot of negative results. However, despite the bad impacts of these uses, how can countries protect themselves in defense and security without these technologies?
First, I want to just sort of think about the ideology of technological progress and how much this informs liberal democracy, transnational politics understood as international affairs. And part of this critique I have of the idea of technological advance comes very strongly from my positionality in the School of Foreign Service, where many of my security studies colleagues really describe the development of technological systems as inevitabilities, right? And so it's like, the drone has developed, we have to use it. There's, no way around this, right? This is a system that must be used. And what this ignores is the millions, billions, trillions of dollars of effort that go into testing, making, and developing these technologies. And many of these efforts are secret for decades until the systems sort of suddenly appear one day and are sold to us as a new technological advance associated with the war on terror. What's important to me in this story about apartheid South Africa is the ways in which technological advance is deeply imbricated with ideas of white supremacy and settler colonialism, and right, the idea of this machine sort of advancing ahead as if there was nothing we could do to stop it, carries all of these resonances with the ways in which ideas of biological racial superiority are being upheld, ideals of, certain countries have the right to certain technologies and others don't, right? All kinds of global hierarchies, right? These are reinforcing each other. And I really want to powerfully interrupt this idea that the technology is somehow advancing. There are decisions and actions that are being made over and over again about how these technologies are being used. And we really need to, step back and say, okay, is this what needs to be done? And just in response to this idea of, how do we use technologies as defense, I am a new hat of mine is working from the perspective of gender, peace, and security, which really argues that no, we don't need to defend ourselves, right? That the work of the nation is undoing this idea of national protection, and that the work of peace is actually one that could challenge and transform and actually make people globally safer. And I understand this may sound a little idealistic, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I really believe that if we stop thinking about the weapons as tools and we start thinking about what kind of relations are we creating, there's a real alternate set of relations where the nation is not this locus for defense and protection and privilege and upholding borders, but really, imagining that as a new place for a different set of relations, which would really move beyond the state and the militarism that has been its basis, I understand, for at least 500 years. So, but I'm for a radical reimagining of how this works.
There's also, you discussed this in Unmanning in your first book. There's also this sense that, these technologies are sort of, or there's the belief that these technologies are sort of tested and experimented in some lab and then deployed when they're fully functional, but that's not actually what's going on. They don't function, and these populations on which they are being deployed are experimental populations, in essence, being used to make these things work better and to use them for funding. Your work really richly speaks to that.
And honestly, I'm very worried about the ways in which this continues to be reiterated. So we've seen, over 20 years of substantial challenges to the narrative that the US military tells us about drone warfare. And over again, the US military tells us, oh, it's just a few errors, it's just a few mistakes, like this technology is getting better and better, it's working more and more. And, the first strike in Afghanistan misrepresented the people that it attacked. The last strike in Afghanistan misrepresented the people that it attacked. And I think this is a really powerful story for us to rethink, how much we buy into this ideal of technological progress and the structures of national defense, and really to call on us to imagine something really different.
Sorry,
Madiha.
good. Can I just ask you finally about this? You're shifting the history, you're shifting our theoretical lens from the story that we hear in Bekaa Valley and Israel and the development of the drone to South Africa. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what that shift does. And first, for people that may not know, just can you tell us about the history as it is narrated with respect to Bekaa Valley, and then kind of tell us in shifting to South Africa. I mean, you've spoken about this a bit, but how are we also shifting our theoretical lens on the drone?
So in the US military and many militaries writ large across the world, there's this sort of model of looking to spectacular battles to draw the best practices from them and to see them as, ways of understanding war and, how to build better militaries. And one of the key examples for, the past almost 40 years has been this 1982 air battle between Israel and Syria, where the Israeli forces were able to destroy Syrian ground defenses, which had not happened in a major military battle up to that point. And in part, were able to do so with drone aircraft that were monitoring where the anti-aircraft munitions were, and then directing the Air Force against these particular sites. And in my book, I contextualize this because it's presented as this sort of amazing moment in military history. But we all know that the war between Israel and Lebanon was an absolute disaster on all kinds of different levels, in terms of humanitarian missions, in terms of effect on civilians, in terms of disrupting Lebanon, in terms of, undoing relationships of power. And so I'm really concerned by the ways in which these particular stories of major military successes are decontextualized from the cultural, social, political, economic impacts of the broader battles associated with them. Right? And so I want to extend that critique also back to the ways in which the Israelis were also using other areas as test sites beforehand. And I don't have the records from how the Israelis used the drones in Operation Protea alongside the South Africans. So I don't know exactly what happened. The air battle in Operation Protea in Angola bears a number of uncanny resemblances, however, to the battle in Bekaa Valley. Similarly, all of the anti-aircraft munitions were destroyed in advance, and it's considered, again, sort of a major air battle and a major air success. How does sort of undoing the firstness of this associated with Bekaa Valley and seeing that it was tested beforehand, again, trouble our assumptions about surprise warfare, about these sort of sets of relationships? And then by contextualizing it in wars in Africa, right, how does this link together the Middle East with Africa and provide us with a different geography, again, that maybe helps us to think about today's drone warfare, right? And we can talk about this geography of drone warfare, which extends all the way across North Africa, all the way through the Middle East, potentially includes the Philippines, if we trust some of the sources that have suggested drone strikes have been carried out there, right? This really problematizes this geography that, particularizes drone warfare as something that is only happening in Pakistan and Afghanistan, although of course those are really important scenarios, and reminds us that this is a form of global occupation. And I really want us to think about that geography, to think about the themes of this panel and this ideas about place, right? And how do these problematic geographies call on us to engage as people who want to work against these forms of technology and violence, to think about different transnational solidarities, as well as, what kind of global alliances does this propose for us to think about?
Thank you so much, Kate. We will come back to Kate, but at the moment, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Actually, Eli Nelson is having a bit of trouble with his internet, so we're working on that. So at the moment, we will go ahead and move to our next presentation, which is Britney Mache.
It's a pleasure to be here. The title of my talk today is Hard Lessons: Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance, and the Quest for Sustainable Empire. And I'm recording this talk about a week and a half after the return of Taliban rule in Afghanistan, an event that has served as yet another painful indication of the utter failure of the global war on terror. The images from Afghanistan blazoned on our screens from global media outlets also offers a reminder of the enormous and agonizing cost borne by communities on the front lines of counterterrorism operations over the last 20 years. And the title of the talk, Hard Lessons, comes from a refrain that I encountered while conducting field work between 2014 and 2019 on security operations in the West African Sahel. And this descriptor was used by active duty and retired US military personnel and personnel working at various United Nations agencies who had previously worked in Afghanistan before coming to their posts in the West African Sahel. And the hard lessons were the purported regrets from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so in my talk, I want to reflect on the shadow cast by these conflicts and what it means for thinking about other regions impacted by the war on terror. So on November 1st, 2019, the United States Air Force announced the official opening of Air Base 201 in Agadez, Niger. The $110 million installation houses the second largest US military presence on the African continent, after Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. Millions of dollars over budget and more than a year behind schedule, the construction of the site began in 2016 after the United States and Nigerian governments signed a 10-year lease agreement. An AFRICOM press release outlining the role of Air Base 201 explained, quote, "In support of our partner forces and international efforts to counter violent extremist organizations in the region, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations have begun out of Nigerian Air Base 201 in Agadez, Niger. United States Africa Command has an agreement with the government of Niger for use of armed and unarmed air assets in its airspace that improve our combined ability to respond to threats and other security issues in the region. These assets are used towards achieving the mutual goals of the United States and our West African partners," end quote. The base is home to Predator and Reaper drones, C-117 and C-130 cargo planes, and serves as a refueling station for US aircrafts. And it accompanies a smaller neighboring drone base operated by the US Central Intelligence Agency. Situated in rural northern Niger, these sites were selected for their perceived geographic advantage in launching surveillance and security missions throughout North and West Africa. In a promotional video produced by Airman Magazine documenting the opening of Air Base 201, Brigadier General Michael Rawls described the installation as, quote, "one of the most Herculean efforts in the history of the United States Air Force," end quote. And by way of emphasizing Rawls' words, the video cycles through wide aerial shots of rural Niger, cutting to a US soldier in fatigue struggling to stand in a sandstorm, and then flashing to fistfuls of brown sand falling from unidentified white hands. Rawls further describes the construction of the base as a, quote, seemingly impossible task conducted in one of the most austere, if not the most austere locations the United States Air Force has ever operated out of, end quote. Ultimately, as the video concludes, American military engineers and logistical ingenuity triumph over the landscape. This video joins a series of others produced by the Defense Visual Information Distribution Service and the Department of Defense. And a common thread links these videos as they emphasize the technical capacity of the US military to forge this infrastructural marvel in a seemingly empty, unforgiving landscape. They also trade in a kind of mediated transparency, inviting viewers behind the scenes of US security operations in the Sahel. And this move makes visible, curated aspects of those operations, even as the projects themselves work to obtain a totalizing vision of the region through their clandestine surveillance missions flown from this base. And the official opening of Airbase 201 occurred 2 years after the deaths of 4 members of a US Army Special Forces team following an ambush in Tongo, Niger, which is near the Malian border. And according to media reports, the soldiers came under fire from fighters affiliated with the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. And these deaths mark the single largest number of American combat troop casualties in an African country since the disastrous intervention in Somalia in 1993. And during interviews I conducted with US senior officials based in Niger at the time of the Tongo attack, they described the deaths of the US soldiers as a watershed moment that illustrated the need for a robust US security presence in the Sahel. They noted the lack of air cover and surveillance support that made the soldiers more vulnerable to attack. But these deaths also prompted questions about what a US presence in the region should look like. Officials expressed concern that increased US casualties would stymie domestic political support for American activities in the Sahel. A press release issued by the Department of Defense shortly after the 2017 attack framed the US's presence in the region as both a boon to Niger, but also imperative for regional security. The report explained, quote, "There are approximately 800 US military personnel in Niger, which is about twice the size of Texas. This number includes personnel supporting the US Embassy in Niamey, personnel supporting construction efforts at Airbase 201 in Agadez, and personnel stationed in the country for other temporary duties and operations. While US Special Forces are advising and assisting the Nigerian armed forces, they make up a fraction of the overall US force composition in Niger. Some of these forces are supporting French operations in the region. The French maintain over 4,000 troops there. Mostly, the US provides refueling, intelligence support, and surveillance support," end quote. So Airbase 201 exists as a single node in a suite of US military bases and installations across the globe, but it highlights the trajectory of contemporary security governance in the West African Sahel specifically. In 2002, immediately after the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks of the previous year, the US government launched Operation Enduring Freedom, Trans-Sahara, and the Pan-Sahel Initiative, the first of what would become several counterterrorism operations in the region. And US military presence in the Sahel has followed a pace from the presidencies of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump. And while the Biden administration has not formally outlined its policy towards the Sahel, it has thus far continued many of the counterterrorism activities of its predecessors. So while counterterrorism projects continue to orient much of this engagement with the Sahel in the present, security actors in the Sahel routinely advocate a light touch or light footprint approach, distinct from activities taking place in parts of East Africa and the Middle East. And this light touch foregrounds strategic monitoring and intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance missions. So thus, proponents of expanded American drone operations in Niger often tout Airbase 201 primarily for these ISR capabilities. Contemporary surveillance infrastructures emerged from a series of technological projects developed in the mid-20th century. So Cold War air defense systems laid the groundwork for contemporary aerial surveillance, and it asserted this US military quest for total situational awareness, or a comprehensive surveillance of the entire globe through automated remote sensing, tracking, and response technologies. But still, it's important to note that the effects and strategies of these tools exceed the merely technical. They are, as geographer Derek Gregory explains, techno-cultural assemblages that simultaneously produce new forms of both distance and intimacy. So amid the predominance of drone usage over the last 2 decades, much has been written about how claims about the precision and accuracy of drones serves to expand the theaters of war making and authorizes an everywhere war. But still, if armed drone attacks have served as a way to theorize the parameters of empire in the present, I think attending to the forms of watchfulness and anticipation at work specifically in the Sahel offers an occasion to contemplate the specific but also contradictory place of surveillance as an imperial infrastructure. The language of watching continues to animate US security policy across the region. And so in this context, ISR, with its reliance on aerial technology, provides a type of corrective to the failures of other theaters, namely in Iraq and Afghanistan. So in interviews I conducted, AFRICOM personnel stressed intelligence gathering and sharing role of the United States, drawing a marked contrast with France, which by that point had deployed several thousand troops across the Sahel. And their repeated invocation of the hard lessons learned in Afghanistan and Iraq betrayed an unwillingness of the US government to contribute large-scale military interventions across Africa. There was a presumed absurdity of an Afghanistan or Iraq-style war on the African continent for these informants, but that this still mandated other kinds of interventions. My informants stressed the need for alternate ways to advance security interests without the liabilities of combat troops. What was revealing, though, is that they still affirmed a requisite vigilance and a desire to remake but assure the continuation of US global militarism. So AFRICOM personnel portrayed Africa as a, quote, low-priority space with less importance than the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And they outlined the challenges of advancing global security on a tight budget. So operations in the Sahel offered a test case for managing a deeply US-American vision of a fundamentally insecure world without accruing the financial, political, and personnel cost of other wars. My informants insisted that the US was not like European Union countries, not interested in being, quote, on the front lines in Africa, end quote, but that the US government still wanted to influence the security trajectory there. Aerial technologies held a particular appeal. So robust networks of surveillance and military intelligence were on offer as providing security comparatively cheaply. And in this framing, while France had put boots on the ground in the Sahel, the US had taken the skies. And as such, the US government, and specifically AFRICOM security experts working on the Sahel, claimed for themselves a technical capacity that France lacked. And indeed, in January 2020, French President Emmanuel Macron requested the US remain in the Sahel because France would be unable to successfully maintain its security projects there without US support. So French policies have been made possible in part through a US-led surveillance apparatus and intelligence sharing arrangements. Now, with President Macron's decision in 2021 to draw down French troops in the Sahel, it remains to be seen how much of these intelligence sharing arrangements will be transferred over to the security services of local Sahelian governments. Still, in public statements, AFRICOM often portrays its policies across Africa as building local security capacity, as providing the tools to, quote, enable African solutions to African problems, end quote. But these African solutions are buttressed by US surveillance. The operations of local militaries depend on intelligence provided by the US in its role as knowledge producer and a steward of this kind of monitoring expertise. And the outsourcing of the most dangerous labor to others, namely the local security forces, facilitates a kind of light touch security as US agencies seek to remain in the position of watcher. The attendant watchfulness that orients light touch security is manifest discursively in press releases, policy briefings, while the material circumstances of an extensive surveillance network aspires to remain out of sight, cloistered within the realm of covert operations and classified intelligence reports. The insistence that Africans solve African problems is belied by the ways that US intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance activities shape the representations of certain kinds of threats. So the dual language of local ownership, coupled with the acknowledgement of ongoing US interests, leaves little room for the possible divergence of those things. This approach holds additional appeal as it is ostensibly unencumbered by accusations of more nefarious forms of foreign intervention. So my informants at AFRICOM, well aware of the critiques of US activities throughout Africa as a kind of neo-colonialism, routinely laughed off such assertions by referencing both the predominance of French troops in the region and contrasting this with what they saw as more benign American surveillance activities. Yet such surveillance activities are ultimately still backed by the deadly force of the US military. So ultimately in my research, I find that ISR stands as both a tactic of security governance and a means for its disavowal. Throughout my interviews, explanations about the surveilling character of US military presence in the Sahel was meant to be reassuring, that it was merely ISR in contrast to more forceful interventions. Yet even as they positioned the US as mere spectator, my informants conveyed that its presence was essential to assure regional stability. In this way, the US was portrayed simultaneously as only there as needed, but also inevitably the final backer of security projects in the region. The US's role became one of knowledge production, of monitoring, of assuring that things don't get too bad. And this advisory and surveillance role was one that it could rightly claim for itself, given its expansive technological abilities in the area. So in conclusion, watching then allows a more circumscribed style of intervention before problems become too large. An American Green Beret based in Burkina Faso explained this to me as the importance of phase zero operations, which affirms sort of AFRICOM's investment in alternate measures of presumed success by asserting its presence in places where the worst effects of conflict have yet to materialize. The routine insistence about keeping an eye on things in the West African Sahel further discloses an imperial desire to observe everything, even or especially when that desire is unattainable. The drive to pursue a totalizing vantage, even as some places are derided as unimportant and not high on the list of political or economic interests, upholds the ability to see and to know what is happening in the Sahel as an unrelinquishable and indefinite project. The small, diffuse network of drone bases, surveillance projects, and intelligence gathering missions in many ways offer a more insidious expression of imperial power than the large-scale invasions and mega bases of places like Iraq and Afghanistan, both because of their protracted and indefinite timescales and also because of their absented presence, the spatial distance that they cultivate. Thus, on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Afghanistan, and as the hard lessons of that war continue to reverberate, we should remain attentive to the shifting nature of global security interventions, and also remain suspicious of attempts to rebuild and fortify a more sustainable version of empire. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Britney. That was a wonderful talk. I think what we will do now is, Britney has had to step away for a moment. So what we will do now is run Eli Nelson's talk, and then we will come back and have a conversation with all of the panelists.
Salvage is something of a buzzword in the two fields I move through most frequently, and it is understood in radically different ways. On one hand, in Native American and Indigenous studies, salvage is a rightfully despised concept and practice. It evokes grave robbing, generations of gawking anthropologists, and ultimately the vanishing race hypothesis that still dominates popular US beliefs about the eventual drawn-out death of Indigenous peoples under settler colonialism. On the other hand, in the history of science, especially post-colonial and science and technology studies, salvage is the subversive domain of the Global South. It is the ingenious practice of repairing and recycling technologies deemed too old or too dirty by a wasteful Global North. And even more so, salvage is the process by which the post-colony has accessed and made use of its own material pasts. In both spaces, salvage is an environmental technology. It is the process by which lands are made to give way to development and anthropogenic change, and it is the way the past is extracted from the landscape as a resource. In other words, salvage is the scientific method of transforming the way we move through and regard landscapes. And it is one method by which the historicity underlying that movement is conceived and reproduced. That the settler and post-colonial embrace of salvage as a nation-building technology dovetail in this way is no coincidence. Salvage was hotly debated and gatekept during the 1960s by US settler scientists, and it was a key theme in post-colonial discourse during the same period. Today, I'm going to outline how archaeologists in the United States developed an anachronistic science of salvage in the midst of the Cold War. This was in self-conscious contrast to archaeologists in post-colonial North Africa as they undertook their own salvage projects in advance of the construction of the Aswan Dam. The methodology of settler archaeologists positioned salvage as a frontier technology that could enable an anachronistic periodization underscoring settler originality. United Arab Republic scientists, on the other hand, worked according to a method that rendered their nation-states as geographic and historical centers after centuries of inhabiting an imposed periphery. In 1965, archaeologist Frederick Johnson published the article Archaeology in Emergency in Science. He wrote, quote, "Everyone is familiar with the spectacular archaeology now in progress on the Upper Nile in areas where the reservoir is to be created by the Aswan Dam. Here, whole temples are being moved to higher levels, and even more importantly, archaeologists are recording the long prehistory of the Nile River Valley before it goes underwater. It was not common knowledge prior to this emergency that the prehistory of the region extends back into Paleolithic times. Probably less well known, at least less dramatically publicized, is the fact that within the United States, the federal government has been conducting since 1947 an interagency archaeological salvage program. This was designed initially to salvage materials to be destroyed by the construction of multi-purpose dams in all parts of the nation. The results may not be as spectacular as those coming from the old world, but they are fully as valuable, for they document a significant part of the long human occupation of the New World." End quote. This 1947 origin that he references is actually on par with the development of salvage as a science internationally. Mid-century industrial acceleration had put many sites of archaeological interest, by which I primarily mean the historical heritage sites of Black and Brown people, had been put in danger, and this was even more so the case in the Global South, where post-colonial nations were tasked with protecting their own heritage from developing global inequities of production and industrialization. However, despite this common trajectory, John Otis Brew, then the director of the Harvard Peabody Museum, had insisted only 2 years earlier, in 1963, that the global origin of salvage archaeology should be rightfully traced not to the international movement and mid-century acceleration and to dam projects at the same time, but instead to Thomas Jefferson's work excavating native burial mounds near Monticello in the 18th century, some hundreds of years earlier. What the Archaeology in Emergency article belies, namely the insecurity about the spectacle of the ancient artifacts of the old world compared to the new, was ultimately eclipsed in US science publications, not only by these claims to early Republic settler colonial salvage projects that appropriated the ancientness of indigeneity in the supposedly New World, but also by critiques of the sentimentality of the method of Old World scientists. On this point, ethnologist James T. Hester, the following year, offered this assessment, quote, "The concept of archaeological salvage in the past 20 years in the United States has changed somewhat through time. Initially, salvage was thought to require few changes in technique, with the major effort being placed on wise selection of the endangered sites to be studied. The techniques to be employed at these selected sites were the traditional ones dictated by the training the researcher had acquired. Through time, it became apparent that a better sample could be acquired by digging more sites rapidly than by digging a few sites with great care. The use of power equipment became commonplace, and techniques of field recovery and laboratory analysis became geared to need for greater speed and standardization. It is interesting to contrast the evolution in techniques described above with those utilized by some of the salvage teams from other countries working in the Aswan Reservoir. A common theme emphasized by many of the latter, primarily those researchers with a background in classical archaeology, was that the salvage situation made possible legalized looting. The concern was not for obtaining a broader informational sample, but instead for the collection of a larger sample of art objects. The result was that the larger sample had less data recovered to document each object, and many items of artistic merit were completely ignored." End quote. If Hester was to be taken at his word, and I'll add that that is not an insignificant or even likely if clause, then why was there a supposedly unscientific concern about legalized looting in Egypt? And why was there a seemingly methodological failure to collect not only the right objects, but to categorize and contextualize them properly? Why was there too much care? Ultimately, the Aswai High Dam project meant to establish a very different kind of landscape with vastly different historical stakes than those of the US landscapes referenced earlier. The Aswan High Dam project, as part of the post-1952 Egyptian Revolution, and more specifically as part of the post-1956 Nasser presidency, was the result of a campaign for agrarian reform and industrialization, and it was part and parcel of the post-colonial nation building in the region during this time period. Salvage of sites and artifacts slated to be flooded was conceptually and financially key to that project, which would reclaim and reimagine Egyptian history and the erection of post-colonial industrial modernity and independence. However, as was often the case, the United Arab Republic was forced into a position of reliance on largely European-led international organizations to fund the project, and archaeologists paid a high price for aid and collaboration with UNESCO members on the project. The British and French invested quite a bit, both in terms of money and scientists from their own nations, in a thinly veiled bid at securing renewed access to colonial excavation sites lost in post-colonial independence, while Sudan and the United Arab Republic were expected to issue asset repayments with interest. The United Arab Republic was expected to provide, quote, "no less than 50% of the finds excavated in Nubia, authorization to carry out further excavations in other parts of Egypt, and the cession of precious objects and monuments, including certain Nubian temples, for transfer abroad," end quote. While Sudan, quote, "for its part offered 50% of the finds from excavations made in its entire territory," end quote. The result of this was that items and sites were indeed being looted, even if the projects were directed and enacted by North African hands. The methods employed at the Aswan High Dam were far more ambivalent than those all-encompassing ones heralded by settler authorities as high data and scientific. Furthermore, the United States was not a member of UNESCO at the time, and accordingly did not benefit from nor impact the method of colonial mining and post-colonial reclaiming of Egyptian sites. The degree to which jealousy was a part of their refashioning of salvage as an American science is not to be understated. Salvage was never just about the systematic study and collection of objects at risk of extinction or being destroyed. It was instead a methodology and a toolkit which involved a quantitative, data-driven method that disciplined very specific ways of seeing and assigning value to objects and landscapes. For settler archaeologists working on stolen indigenous land, salvage was a means of data collection that privileged breadth and speed and was to a certain extent blind to the cultural value of objects in and of themselves. It was a method of knowledge production that worked precisely because it was a spatial and cultural transgression upon indigenous people and land relations. This focus on speed and scope is a marker of settler frontier sciences that had developed over the course of the 19th century on the North American continental frontier and was being reimagined in the 20th century, and especially in the midst of the Cold War, through the process of what Choctaw theorist Jody Bird calls transit, the use of Indianness, and I would add the spatial use of frontier, as a point through which the settler empire makes itself, and I would add makes spaces and peoples prone to colonization, as the US was then projecting upon North Africa and the Middle East. The US used salvage as a tool to create frontiers and an anachronism as a tool to create a historicity in which it was always first. The use of salvage as a spatial and geographic tool was not unique. Indeed, you can see the same process in post-colonial North Africa. The epistemological difference between the two, by which I mean the methods and values, did indeed create different spaces, however. The science of salvage depended on how its practices could create a frontier, and it could create a frontier as easily as it could create a pioneer, and at the same time, salvage could be used to challenge a center, to make a periphery, and to construct a post-colonial subject.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. So now we'll have time to ask our panelists questions and open the floor for discussions. So we wanted to start with a question about time and temporality. You all mobilize different temporal horizons in your talk, and I want to ask you about the relationship between temporality and geospatial divides. Kate, you talked about the obscuring of pasts. Eli talked about salvage as a mode of understanding. And Brittany spoke of a corrective regime that was designed to make up for past failures. Brittany, perhaps I'll start with you. In giving us the view from the Sahel, a place you place watching and watchfulness at the center of your analysis to expand our understanding of imperial spaces. The technologies of watching are geospatial assemblage of power. Now, you're also talking about temporality. Specifically, you speak about the relationship of surveillance to anticipation, to a certain kind of corrective futurity, which is about controlling the future through what has been presented to be a light footprint presence. Now, we have a question from the audience that I'd like to fold into this question to you. Our audience member asked you, is wondering particularly how you see this working in relation to the broader preemptive model often associated with the US war on terror, where a perpetual future threat becomes the basis to justify imperial violence and policing in the present. Do you think that the temporality of the US approach of watching in the Sahel is an expansion or a particular version of preemption, or maybe something a bit distinct? And perhaps can you also comment on how these things might change with a potential withdrawal of troops on the ground?
Thank you for those questions.
Thank you.
So I think I have kind of two versions of that. So yes, scholars who have thought about the war on terror have thought about different forms of anticipatory governance, of preemptive both strikes, but also preemptive investments in certain types of security infrastructure. But I really want to situate my answer through the African continent. So one of the kind of discursive milieu that I entered into was this idea of kind of Africa as the future. And so this was said by a kind of range of informants. So this could be at a kind of youth politics mobilization about the kind of future of African youth and advocating for different types of governance regimes on the African continent, but it could also be in conversations with DoD personnel or State Department personnel who would say, Africa is the future of new wars. And this is a conversation that happened in the 1990s. This is a discourse that happened in the 1990s. But I do think that there's a way that the shadow cast by CENTCOM, the sort of failings of CENTCOM, do influence this kind of Africa as the future in the sense of how might we workshop different forms of security making to account for some of those failures while also anticipating the kinds of conflict which may emerge, of which the US presents itself as being both a necessary participant in, but one that does not want to incur some of the costs that it had in previous wars. So I do think that there are multiple ways of thinking about that kind of future horizon, but I also do want to kind of hold that kind of Africa as the future, which is a kind of recurring refrain that I'm thinking with in my work.
If I can follow up a bit on that, I wanted to get a sense from you about the different layers of imperial assemblages here. You're talking about French troops on the ground, the US has the air, and kind of, if you can speak a little bit about how do these different layers of empire operate together, who can make sovereign claims, who gets to have airspace, who gets to be on the ground. And related to that, in your talk, you mentioned that your interlocutors were concerned about not being seen as colonial, right? And that, so I'm wondering, to what extent is the US in a way a quote unquote post-colonial empire, in the sense that, you know, the idea of not being a colonial power figures into the ideologies and the tactics and techniques of your interlocutors?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, because this was something that perhaps I was surprised at in sort of presenting what has become, I think, a very popular imperial critique of the war on terror. When I presented that to some of my informants at AFRICOM, they would give a range of responses. And one was to point the finger at France in a variety of ways. And so one of the kind of quotes that stands out to me is somebody saying, member of the Office of Security Cooperation in Dakar, that France owns this fight. We don't own this fight. And then sort of going on to elaborate the ways that there's no kind of status of forces agreement. So US personnel on the ground aren't even considered to be in any kind of active combat. So this really is France's fight. But also the ways that the US wanted to reflect on a kind of post-colonial moment. And I think this harkens back to a kind of Cold War moment when the US supported different decolonization efforts. In some ways, the kind of official line is because, you know, the US just believed in sort of freedom of the third world, but there's also the sense that by removing some of the imperial infrastructure laid by France and England, there was a way for the US to kind of enter into those spaces with different forms of soft power. And so I do think that the kind of inclusion of a certain kind of post-colonial critique within sort of AFRICOM, both sort of documents, but also in kind of informants in the ways that they narrate their work, is really important to grapple with, because I think just a kind of flattened anti-imperial critique doesn't sort of account for the ways that the people who are actually doing this work understand their own sort of projects as perhaps different or anti-imperial when one sort of considers the legacies, especially in a place like West Africa. So that's something that I'm sort of thinking through, the ways that kind of those rival ideas about imperial power become a moment of kind of disavowal or even deflection.
Sorry, I actually had a follow-up question. Adrien, do you want to go?
No, please go ahead.
I actually had a question about disavowal, and this is to both of you, Britney and Kate. I was wondering, you know, Kate, you speak about technological superiority and technological advance, and Kate and as underwriting a racial divide, right? And naturalizing and erasing histories of violence that are entangled with the drone technology. And Britney, you talk about the US using its technological capabilities to both appropriate a certain kind of role, but also to disavow that role. And I was thinking, in relation to my own work, I remember looking at some CIA leaked documents where they were very much talking in this language of partnership, where they're talking about, we provide the technological capabilities, our partners, our regional partners, provide the sort of cultural know-how and the geopolitical know-how. So I'm wondering if we can, and also the use of drone technology in Pakistan, for instance, one of the explanations for that has been that this does not violate the sovereignty of the state in a way that troops would. So I'm wondering, can we, to get both of you to reflect a little bit on what is it about technology and technical capacities that engenders the space for these kinds of disavowals?
Brittany, should I start? All right. This is a tough question, Madiha.
Sorry, I don't have an answer to it either. So it's what I think about.
It's a very important question that I agree. It's really worth thinking about, and I think it really ties back to some of the questions that Britney is raising in her analysis. Right? Is like, what is the difference between imperial occupation on the ground and this disavowed occupation through ISR operations, which continue to be backed up by this idea of force? And what is it about the ways in which these function in this particular post-Cold War moment, right? So, there's something that harkens to the Cold War, which is why I say post-Cold War, but it's also different than the 1990s Cold War, and also sort of like speaking to this other moment. And, thinking a little bit about Adrien's question as well, like how does this tie to questions of time and space, and the militarization of time and space, which is something that I'm really worried about. We might add to this the datafication of time and space as the collection of data is increasingly becoming sort of a global regime of power that is, accumulating new forms of data and using it for all kinds of economic, military, and other kinds of advance. And I think there's really powerful rhetorical work, and I've used this word very carefully, being done by saying that these technologies are the actors. And I think the US has been described as a kind of technophilia, right? And so this also goes back to the Cold War, but I think this has been, shared broadly and also has become part of a sort of message of globalization as well. There's this idea that the technologies are somehow driving the economy, they're driving national security, they're driving social, cultural relationships. And I think approaches like the ones offered by science and technology studies and, numerous other forms of critique, post-colonial critiques, indigenous critiques, might ask us to more carefully take apart this human-machine divide and this sort of simpleness of saying there are machines on the one hand and humans on the other hand, and instead think about the sort of very messy complexities, right, that are interwoven here, and the ways in which saying that this is being driven by machines is obscuring the ways in which political decisions by all kinds of different actors are being taken all of the time in the sort of developments of these different regimes of power. And I don't have any simple answers for addressing this, but I think it's really interesting to see how the base in Niger is described as a technological wonder, as opposed to all of the other ways in which this base could be described. And how is this metaphor of a technological wonder, troubling or tied to these post-Cold War forms of post-colonialism? So that's one attempt to answer it.
Yeah, and so I'll pick up there by saying, in this kind of broader book project that I'm working on, I do attempt to kind of trace a lineage from the Cold War, but thinking through environmental surveillance, environmental monitoring, because I think in reckoning with the specific sort of histories of the West African Sahel, you can't sort of miss the way that these kind of developmentalist logics are also at play, that these nation states become sort of within a UN sort of hierarchy, some of the least developed, that need certain types of technological projects to effectively sort of catch them up, right? And so I think when sort of thinking about developmental sort of ideas, there's a way that the kind of expansiveness of infrastructure projects like this drone base become another sort of additive. We are sort of offering this to the state of Niger, which would not be able to assemble a base like this, would not be able to marshal the technological know-how in order to police its borders, right? So I think I'm trying to sort of also situate these kind of technological projects within a kind of racialized developmentalist logic, which has oftentimes accompanied the ways that the US, as well as European and also international organizations, have enacted different policies within this region. So, but it is something that I think allows for that disavowal because it is presented as sort of the gift of technology to places that don't have it.
Thank you so much. We have a few more questions. One of them comes from us and is about your method and your experience conducting research. You both have, fascinating documents and voices to work with. And so we're both curious on how you navigate researching such topics. And then a question from the audience is about, perhaps the way I understand the question is how do, countries that are less wealthy than industrial states like Europe or the United States, and given the proliferation of drones, what is there, in a sense, it's easy to say that perhaps we should disarm, or it's easy to criticize drones, but the reality is that they're being sent there. So how do perhaps, states that have less of an industry, less of a, an armament industry, how can they defend themselves? How can they, develop systems to shield themselves from drone warfare? Now, I know that this might be, this is a sort of a counterfactual question, or is it, I know you're not policymakers, but if you have ideas, if you've thought of that in the past, because the reality is that whatever we say about drones, they are proliferating. And they are being deployed by industrialized states. So perhaps these two questions, one on methodology and one of perhaps the future of drone warfare from the perspective of late industrializers, let's say. Thank you.
So maybe I'll kind of jump at the kind of methods question, because I think in sort of reflecting on doing research on security infrastructures, I think there is this kind of fetish of access, that if you get access to the kind of key players, that will reveal something substantive. And yet what I found, especially in sort of conducting interviews at AFRICOM headquarters, there was a way that a certain type of openness to researchers was presented as a kind of hallmark of AFRICOM attempting to do something different. And so when I sort of think about my own access and my own interviews, I'm also trying to be sort of critical of the ways that in and of itself gets written into a narrative about the ways that AFRICOM is trying to sort of learn lessons and make itself available. One of my informants said, we have nothing to hide, right? We invite researchers to come to the base. We invite researchers to come do observations at our mill-to-mill trainings. And so I think I'm really still grappling with this. What does it mean to sort of do this type of research and sort of embark, especially on kind of ethnographic methods, when that itself becomes part of a kind of legitimating narrative about the command? So it's something that I'm still kind of working through.
So, I mean, about the methodological question, I agree. I think there's a real fetish with the idea of what can be seen and what can not be seen. And I have really tried in my research to think about what is continuously being obscured in the research that I'm doing. So I think there's a real, I mean, and this is in all of academics, but in it is the Enlightenment history of the university, right? That we want to illuminate and expose and sort of bring to the light and find out the truth and all of these other sorts of things. And I think in my research practice, it's really important to point to the limits of all of those ways, right? And so I like talking about the secret documents that I have no access to, and those are overlaid of, you know, I have no information about the people from Mozambique or Angola who these operations were flown against, right? And there's a real erasure built on erasure that is part of what I'm building knowledge out of. And I think recognizing the flimsiness of some of this and the opacity, the obscurity, and you know, the fallacies that are sort of hidden in all of this information is really important for us to think about what happens when government actors tell us they have the truth. And again, this is not in the sort of conspiracy way that has often been taken, but as a real way of sort of thinking about what is our role as a public and what is this sort of question of our relationship to truth, and particularly truths about national security, which, you know, have this privileged relationship with secrecy, right? And I mean, this might tie into my answer for the second question, which is, you know, to think about the global arms trade itself, right? And my interest in the illegal drone sale of from Israel to South Africa is not incidental. It was only a very, very minor portion of the ways in which the UN embargo against weapons to South Africa was violated by many, many, many countries of the globe, including the United States, France, England. The banking was all done in Brussels, you know, even communist countries were able to get weapons to South Africa, right? Like, what does this, you know, militarized global exchange of weapons mean for us, right? And the last time I checked, I think it's like an over $2 trillion industry, which is, you know, a massive, massive, massive amount of money. And drones are an incidental part of that. Right? There are so many other weapons. There are so many other weapons to be deeply concerned about. It's not just drones. There's landmines, there's fighter jets, there's tanks, there's machine guns, there's, you know, the drone. For me, it's important that we don't over fetishize this particular technology and are rather talking about the sort of militarization of the globe that we live in, and, you know, ask ourselves this question of how can we scale back the sort of normalization of militarization as like the experience of living in the contemporary globe. And, you know, it's ties to development, right? And this idea that to be a developed nation, part of that is having a, you know, well-functioning military with, you know, great ISR capabilities. This is normalizing a state of securitization that is, you know, not a world that I want to live in. So trying to think through that and trying to think about not just the drone, but the scale of this, and, you know, the massive investments in weapons worldwide, and the ways in which, you know, retirement funds are caught up in this money. Day-to-day life is shaped by these relationships, right? You know, little kids are being given drones as presents to go fly around, right? And this is nothing new, right? These are patterns that are being repeated. We've seen them in Hollywood for, you know, decades. This is part of this normal globe where security is part of day-to-day life. And I think it's this real challenge to think about how can we begin to undo that and not think about that as like a fundamental part of how we live, whatever that we is. And again, who is excluded from this? And, you know, what attention do we need to, how is that obscured in simply the discussions that we are able to have? So.
Thank you, Kate. I think what you're saying in terms of the fetishization of the drone is, I'm thinking back now to Britney's presentation, you know, in many ways, the drone quadrone appears that way because of the redistribution of labor and the most dangerous labor to other, you know, groups of people, other racialized populations. And so I'm wondering, Britney, just in terms of, you know, Summer al-Balushi, who was here on the last panel, was also talking about kind of the way that African security states fit into the context of these broader assemblages. And so I'm wondering, in the context of the Sahel and ISR, you know, how does, you know, ISR fit into sort of the security assemblages in the Sahel and kind of the actors there? What are their motivations for being part of this? What are their kind of, how do they make sense of this, and in what ways are they imbricated in this process?
So I think in most of my interviews, the language of partnership was really stressed. Even to the kind of minutiae of, well, no, this specific agency within a local government has to make a formal ask that goes to the State Department, and then DoD gets it, and then we set up the trainings, but that's done in conjunction with asking the local government, what exactly do they need? And so I think there's a way that the kind of localizing of responsibility is something that I've tried to kind of problematize while not losing sight of the ways that kind of local dynamics also inform what might make the Nigerian state kind of amenable to some of these agreements, what might make heads of state kind of interested in building up armaments, especially perhaps when there have been histories of non-democratic transitions of power or robust social movements that perhaps an expanded police force might be sort of attractive in sort of preventing some of those protest movements. I also think there's a way, and I appreciate you mentioning Summer's work, thinking about this type of, these types of partnerships as a kind of labor regime, right? So one of my informants said, you know, we can't make them all peacekeepers and cops and soldiers, but right now that's kind of the most attractive form of labor in a lot of African states, especially for sort of younger men. And so there's a way that these sort of projects are both kind of localized, but also enter in what is a kind of racialized disparity in sort of the global economy about who does what kind of labor. So really thinking about the local dynamics without sort of losing sight of the ways that those kind of local dynamics again become a mechanism for disavowal, to say, no, we are asked to be here. We as the US government are asked to be here. We as France are asked to be here because the Nigerian state needs help with this, needs help with that.
So I wanted to, we're moving towards our closing time. We wanted to end by approximately 2:45. I wanted to ask, we wanted to ask actually as a closing question, we have, you know, this is a public humanities grant that we have gotten for this series. And so one of the questions that we have for our speakers is, you know, what is the sort of one takeaway that you would want kind of broader publics to take from your work, people beyond academia, to kind of, you know, just like one point that you want to get across. So either of you are welcome to go first.
I mean, so my go-to is kind of hokey in the sense, you know, another world is possible. I think there's also a way that the kind of normalization of security infrastructure sometimes feels like there's no outside, but there are both local movements on the African continent. There's a kind of robust anti-war history within the United States. There are possibilities for other ways of living. And so I think that is the kind of takeaway to, I think, anyone who may be sort of listening to this, to not sort of get stuck in the kind of myopia of this is the only way that it can be, that there are sort of concrete steps that can be taken, whether it's slashing or defunding Department of Defense, whether it's investing in different kinds of infrastructures of care, whether it's reformatting or rethinking the United Nations so it actually becomes a forum where people can sort of bring grievances and sort of address conflict in a ways that is not just this kind of proving ground for different states to kind of throw their weight around. I think that there are possibilities to create institutions that can actually reckon with violence in ways that don't privilege militarized solutions.
Thank you. Kate?
I love Brittany's points. Those are excellent. Thank you so much. So I echo everything that she said. That was really wonderful. I mean, to that, I would add that technologies are humans, right? And that humans are technologies, right? That this is not a sort of simple, and we can think about this in everything from the discourses about Facebook, all the way to AI, all the way to drones. What we're talking about here are assemblages of people, institutions, and technological systems. And so if we don't like what is happening with them, right, that is not some kind of, dehumanizing system that cannot be transformed. It may be dehumanizing absolutely at this moment, but that is deeply tied to human actions. And we don't need to become Luddites. We could really transform and rethink how these systems operate and work. And I think that's part of the other world that I also imagine is possible.
Thank you so much. We'd like to thank our panelists for joining us. This was really wonderful. Unfortunately, Eli Nelson couldn't join us today, but it was really lovely to speak to you, Kate, and to you, Britney. Thank you so much for those insights. We also want to thank several faculty members, including Manan, Ahmed, Marwa, Elshakry, and Brinkley Messick, who have co-organized this series with us. Technologies of Power has been made possible with the support of the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University, as well as the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, the Departments of History and Anthropology, and the Middle East Institute. And finally, of course, we want to thank our current home institutions, Arizona State University and the University of Toronto. So do check out our website, technologiesofpower.org, for our upcoming events, and follow us on Twitter, Tech of Power. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks. Bye-bye.